Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We will be starting shortly. We're just waiting for more people to join, so stay with us. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar that introduces the latest Forest 500 human rights briefing called the Human Rights Blind Spot in Deforestation Action. My name is Yula Rocha, Indigenous and Climate Project Manager at People's Palace Project, and I will be moderating this webinar. This event is being recorded and will be turning to a Global Canopy podcast, so don't worry if you miss anything, you'll be able to catch up later. There will be an opportunity for questions, so please use the Q&A box and we'll try to cover as many of those as we can. On our panel today, Adriana Ramos, Public Policies Specialist at Instituto Socioambiental in Brazil, Cathal Doyle, Coordinator Legal and Human Rights Program, Forest Peoples Program, Emma Thomson, Forest 500 and Tracking Lead at Global Canopy, and Giulia Bondi, EU Senior Campaigner at Global Witness. I'm a Brazilian journalist and a former US correspondent, but now based in London and working for People's Palace Projects. PPP, as we call it, it's an arts research center focused on climate and social justice based at Queen Mary University of London. For over 25 years, we've been working with academics, activists, and artists to create change. For the past decade, we've been collaborating with indigenous artists in the South Amazon Basin in Brazil, fostering research and cultural exchanges. Our indigenous partners live in a territory surrounded by soy plantations and cattle in Brazil. Needless to say that they are deeply affected by deforestation and their rights are constantly under threat. PPP is also at the forefront of a global movement to integrate arts, culture, and creative industry into the heart of the climate debates. We believe in the transformative power of the arts to inspire ethical and moral changes across all sectors of society. By influencing public and consumer consciousness, we hope our advocacy work will lead to policy changes by COP30 next year in Belém, Brazil. So I'm going to start giving a little bit of context about deforestation. If deforestation were a country, it would be the third highest emitter in the world. Successfully tackling deforestation requires effective action on the human rights abuses associated with this. This briefing today is based on the findings from the Forest 500 annual report. Forest 500 identifies the 350 companies and 150 financial institutions with the greatest exposure to tropical deforestation risk and assesses them on the strength and implementation of their commitments on deforestation, conversion of natural ecosystems, and associated human rights. A decade of Forest 500 data has shown that human rights must be embedded and better understood as linked to deforestation. This webinar and the accompanying briefing aims to give an overview of this critical link and offer practical guidance for companies and financial institutions. Once again, any questions you have, please use the Q&A box provided, and this webinar will look to cover the on-the-ground impact of ignoring human rights when it comes to deforestation, a focus on the importance of having commitments on free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, and respecting customary rights to land, resources, and territory. Data on financial institutions and companies that are lagging behind, and recommended actions for companies and financial institutions and policymakers. Before we go into findings of the briefing, let's start with Adriana Ramos, Public Policies Specialist at Instituto Socioambiental. Adriana, please give us a sense of how far we've come in Brazil over the last 18 months and how far we still have to go.
Thanks, Yula, and thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Instituto Socioambiental, the organization I work to, have been working for 30 years in partnership with indigenous peoples, quilombolas communities, and traditional communities in general, supporting the management and development of their territories, but also advocating for their rights. I think that with the new government, Brazil has resumed its agenda to combat deforestation. From August 23 to June this year, deforestation was reduced by more than 50%, the lowest rate since 2016. One critical situation is still in place is fire. Map Biomas places the Amazon as the second ecosystem most devastated by fire in Brazil, only behind the Cerrado. 42% of everything that was burned between 1985 and 2023 occurred in the Amazon. And uncontrolled fire, we know, is a threat to local communities. In addition to the plan to prevent and combat deforestation, environmental policy was also resumed with the reopening of social participation space. However, due to internal and external pressure on the government, traditional peoples and communities' main demands regarding their rights, especially the demarcation and titling of indigenous lands and traditional territories, were not followed or met. Only 8 indigenous lands were homologated since the new government arrived. Of course, comparing to the previous government, it's something that we have to applaud, but it's still too low. The Brazilian Congress stance has been recurring in initiatives that undermine human rights in general and indigenous and traditional communities' land rights. The lobby of the private sector against land rights also affects the Supreme Court. Besides land recognition, there is a strong pressure to open indigenous territories to mining and agribusiness activities, which would undermine the important role that indigenous lands play in climate balance. This scenario of low political support for the demands of indigenous and traditional peoples and communities has been reflected in violence in the countryside, especially in regions where the level of land rights recognition is slower, such as Mato Grosso do Sul. A survey from the Indigenous Missionary Council points out that indigenous peoples were victims of more than 1,200 property violations and 200 murders in 2023. Across the country, more than 400 incidents of attacks against indigenous people were recorded in 2023. This list includes attempted murders, rapes, attacks, and assaults. So the results of reducing deforestation are minimized in the face of this violence. And the threats to the human rights and specifically the land rights of these communities are in the top of the priorities so that we can really say that we are dealing with this challenge the way the world expects Brazil to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. The Forest 500 data incorporates 7 human rights that are particularly impacted when it comes to deforestation and land conversion. 3 of these human rights, the requirement for free, prior, and informed consent, commonly known as FPIC, respect for customary rights to land resources and territory, and zero tolerance for violence and threats against forest, land, and human rights defender happen around the point of deforestation, as Adriana was mentioning. So tackling them is crucial to stop deforestation in the first place. This briefing particularly focuses on free, prior, and informed consent. Cathal Doyle, as the coordinator, legal and human rights program at the Forest Peoples Program, please talk to us about FPIC and why it is so crucial.
Thank you, Giulia. So yeah, maybe just to start off that in 2007, when the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it recognized FPIC as the minimum standard to ensure Indigenous peoples' dignity, well-being, and survival whenever externally proposed projects impact on their lands and forests. And even prior to this, human rights bodies had clarified that when implementing projects without FPIC, states or companies are in fact discriminating racially against Indigenous peoples as it denies them their rights to their ancestral territories and their natural resources, and as a result, their very identity. Now, in the 2 decades since then, the right safeguarding role of FPIC has been reaffirmed by human rights bodies and courts, by OECD national contact points, by good practice industry standards and certification schemes, and by financial institutions such as the IFC and Equator Principle institutions. And it's now recognized in the policies of around 40% of Forest 500 companies and investors. So this right to FPIC is derived from the collective rights to lands, territories, and resources, to self-determination, to cultural integrity, non-discrimination. And so it's intimately linked with respect for customary land tenure, and it must be obtained even if Indigenous lands are not recognized under international law. And similarly, for consent to be free, there has to be absolutely no intimidation or violence against land rights defenders. So this means that when companies and investors are securing FPIC or validating that it's obtained and maintained, they must carry out human rights, due diligence, and impact assessments to identify lands and forests held under customary land tenure and to guarantee zero violence against land rights defenders. And crucially, this assessment and due diligence must address both titled and untitled lands, as many Indigenous peoples hold land under customary tenure that's not yet titled and demarcated by national land authorities. But despite the important developments in international law and in company and investor policies on FPIC, the reality on the ground that we see is that companies are failing to obtain good faith, documented and independently verified FPIC, and investors are not using their leverage to ensure that they do so. And this is reflected in a growing number of community and civil society complaints to international, regional and national courts and mechanisms regarding corporate failures to obtain FPIC. And not only is this at odds with the independent responsibility of businesses to respect human rights, it's also inconsistent with climate change commitments, because research irrefutably shows that respect for Indigenous peoples' territorial rights, including FPIC, is the most effective way to protect the forests in their lands. FPIC is therefore crucially sitting at the nexus between respect for human rights, Indigenous peoples' cultural and physical survival, and the protection of their forests that are essential for climate change mitigation. And guaranteeing FPIC is also essential to avoiding legal and reputational risks for companies and investors, and to ensuring that they can contribute to the greater good of society.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to turn to Emma Thomson, who is the Forest 500 and tracking lead at Global Canopy. And it's time to talk about the findings from this year's report, Emma.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us as well. So as with previous Forest 500 reports, this year's briefing highlighted the blind spot that companies and financial institutions have when it comes to addressing the human rights that are associated with deforestation and ecosystem conversion. We've been assessing companies for over 10 years with the Forest 500, and what that 10 years of data shows us is that human rights still need to be better understood as linked to deforestation and conversion, and it still needs to be better embedded into company and financial institution action on deforestation. So as you can see, in the latest assessments, just 1% of the companies that are most exposed to tropical deforestation risk have a policy that covers all of the human rights aspects that we assess in the Forest 500. And even the companies and financial institutions with deforestation commitments, their policies rarely include human rights as well. And so this permits abuses to continue and also slows progress towards deforestation-free and net zero targets. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So as Yula said, in Forest 500, we assess companies and financial institutions on different human rights, which you can see on the screen here. But in this briefing, we've chosen to specifically focus on 3 key areas that are particularly critical in preventing deforestation and conversion from happening in the first place. Violations of these rights typically happen around the point of deforestation itself. So these are the requirement for FPIC, respect for customary rights to land, resources and territory, and zero tolerance for violence and threats against forest, land and human rights defenders. So they're the first 3 sections of the graph that you can see there. Testing for and securing FPIC is a critical way companies must engage with Indigenous peoples and local communities before making any new acquisitions or developments. If you look at the central line at the top here, we can see that although the majority of Forest 500 companies are still without a publicly available FPIC commitment, 40% do now have one, which has more than doubled compared to 10 years ago. While 31% of financial institutions have published a policy encouraging or requiring their clients or holdings to test for FPIC of Indigenous peoples and local communities, compared to just 13% in 2014. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. But setting and implementing commitments on FPIC alone is not enough, as we've just heard. Companies must also commit to respecting the customary rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities to land, to resources and territory, and also have a zero tolerance approach to violence and threats against forest, land, and human rights defenders. These policies and commitments for companies should cover their own operations, but also their suppliers, and that will push change through supply chains. So whether it's an upstream company or a downstream company, these are all issues that need to be addressed. And for financial institutions, which are providing finance to these companies, they must use their leverage that the financing they provide gives them and require their clients or holdings to act on these issues through their supply chains. However, as you can see on the graph here, where companies are shown in blue and financial institutions in orange, the majority of those with an FPIC commitment are failing to also address these other rights and issues as well. So although 40% of companies and 31% of financial institutions have an FPIC policy, 91% of Forest 500 companies do not have a single publicly available commitment to refrain from any land developments or land acquisitions until any conflicts relating to customary rights to land, resources, and territories have been resolved. And 91% of financial institutions do not encourage or require their clients or holdings to respect these rights either. And then finally, 93% of companies have not published a commitment to adopt a zero tolerance approach to violence and threats against forest, land, and human rights defenders, with just 7% publishing that for at least one commodity. And as you can see on the graph, just a single financial institution has adopted a zero tolerance policy for its financing activities. So what this data shows us is that it's clear that there's a really long way to go in terms of corporate and financial institution action on human rights associated with deforestation and conversion, and we need to see that picture change. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. So now it's time to talk about legal requirements, and Giulia is here with us from Global Witness. She knows all about the law, so Giulia, walk us through the law.
Thank you very much, Giulia, and hello, everyone. Yes, I'm here to discuss and present to you a little bit about the what's happening in the EU specifically, and on the EU deforestation regulation, which it's likely that many of you have already heard about it. There are also, just to say that there are also other instruments in the EU, which I will not touch upon here, but can be also interesting for links with human rights. So we can be next slide, please. So yes, so the EU Deforestation Free Products Regulation was adopted in 2023, has already entered into force, and it has two specific objectives. The first one is to minimize risk that products in supply chains associated with deforestation and forest degradation end up in the EU market, and also to increase the demand for trade in legal and deforestation-free commodities and products, with the overall objective to achieve the climate and biodiversity targets and therefore contribute to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of specific elements of the EUDR, we are talking about legislation that requires companies and traders to undertake mandatory due diligence obligations. The commodities and products needs to be both deforestation free and legal. and they need to be traced back to the plot of land. The regulation includes about 7 different commodities plus derived products, so there is quite a long list. And when it comes to the legality requirements, which are very important for the discussion today, the commodities and products will have to also be compliant with the laws of the country of production. So companies will have to make sure that these laws are properly applied. And we're talking about specifically of land use rights, labor rights, third-party rights, human rights protected under international law, and the principles of FPIC. There will also be a country benchmarking system, which will assess a different level of risk assigned to different countries. Next slide, please. So in terms of really key 3 messages that I would like to convey today are mostly around the fact that, first of all, Global Witness, with decades of investigations into human rights and deforestation, the role that agribusinesses and financial institutions are playing in driving these abuses and destruction is evident and cannot be denied. That assessing legality risks related to indigenous peoples, tenure rights, and human rights are a prerequisite to achieve deforestation-free supply chains. So it's an important step for companies that they really need to assess this risk if they really want to go into deforestation-free supply chains. And the UDR is providing this opportunity with these legality requirements, but also the UDR can be seen as an instrument to be used in different countries to push for national governments for better laws to protect human rights.
Sorry, Yula, I think your microphone is on.
I'm sorry. I was so concerned of having noises around here. Okay, thank you for that. I can see some questions already at the chat box and also at the Q&A box. So we will have time to go through these questions and answer as many as we can. And don't worry if you have missed anything. This webinar is being recorded. I'm going to go back now to Adriana Ramos to ask her, what do you want to see, Adriana, from companies and financial institutions?
Well, thanks, Yula. I think that the expectation of social environmentalists all around the world is to see real commitment and effective actions. The briefing shows we are too far from that. I think that's not possible to separate human rights from the environmental performance of companies. And we had so many coalitions, roadmaps, frameworks, several platforms and commitments that have been created to support the private sector in improving their social environmental standards. However, even those are not being quite fulfilled. And when it comes to human rights, we are still very far away from the expected results. I think that it's important that we make an in-depth assessment of where the problem lies. It seems to me that when we have a genuine willingness and commitment to solutions, the various stakeholders involved generally have the capacity to provide the necessary alternatives. But in this case, it seems to me that so many initiatives have become like a comfort zone for the private sector. So once they sign a commitment like that, they see, well, check, I've been too far here, And I think that we need to go much further, and we need to count on the political support of the private sector so that these issues can be addressed. We know that many of the challenges are things that have to be, faced by public policies. But what we see, especially here in Brazil, is that the private sector lobby against the solutions on that. So I think that if we don't have a real commitment in the political level, we will keep these numbers of effectiveness as low as it is now, and we won't be able to find solutions and to go to the decisions we should have in time for avoiding, especially in the case of the Amazon, the tipping point of the Amazon, for example, you know. So we have to rush. And I think that the private sector have to be much more ambitious than it is now. Thank you.
Thanks, Cathal. Same question to you. You told us at the beginning that the FPIC, the free prior informed consent, is so important, but we can see that that is not enough, and not enough has been done. So how do we get the systems change here?
Yeah, that's a big question, Giulia. I suppose just thinking about system change in relation to FPIC, maybe there are three kind of points that jump out at me. First is the need for coherent policies. So as I mentioned before, 40% of companies have FPIC commitments, but when we look at commitments to customary land tenure or zero tolerance against violence, that's far less. And given that FPIC is a safeguard for land rights and for the rights of those who are defending their lands, it doesn't make any sense to have an FPIC commitment without those other commitments as well. That's a really important point. I think the second very important point is that compliance with national law is just not sufficient, and it's an imperative that human rights due diligence of investors and companies look at state law and practice against international human rights obligations, including FPIC. And this is particularly the case when we see national forestry laws that are actually legalizing deforestation and land conversion and land acquisition by commercial actors without requiring and verifying Indigenous peoples' FPIC, which is essentially legalizing land grabs. So whenever agro-industrial or commercial forestry projects or investments that affect Indigenous peoples are authorized by states without FPIC, companies need to take extra measures to ensure FPIC is respected, secured, and properly validated. And in those cases, investors have heightened due diligence responsibilities, and they can play a very important role. As what we see in our work in FPP is that companies are often complicit in denying FPIC by relying on inadequate or unimplemented national laws. So there's a real need for a major upgrade in corporate systems for verification of sustainability standards, including FPIC. And then finally, very importantly, in many parts of the world, the legal frameworks are inadequate for ensuring respect for Indigenous people's rights, and Indigenous peoples are proactively responding by developing their own FPIC, autonomous FPIC laws and protocols to safeguard their rights. And human rights bodies and national courts in many instances have said that these need to be respected and state and company guidelines should not take precedent over them. So where these protocols exist, companies and investors must ensure they're respected throughout the investment lifecycle. And where communities wish to develop them, they need to have the time and space to do that. Thanks.
Great. The point being, my question is to Giulia. Politicians listening, Giulia, can and will laws be strengthened?
Thanks. Well, certainly the EUDR is a world's first, and is not perfect at all, especially on human rights. We were calling a civil society for stronger obligations. But it's an opportunity for companies and hopefully for financial institutions when times will come. Rolling back should not be an option. So the EUDR was overwhelmingly voted by all political groups in the European Parliament and by member states of the EU. So it's important that now it's implemented and and that it will be enforced by the end of this year. Unfortunately, we are seeing here in the EU a shift in the political landscape, and last week, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who got reappointed, in sharing her political guidelines for the next mandate, she mentioned that it will be important to simplify certain rules to ensure competitiveness for companies and cutting the red tape. So this is a concern, and I think it will be it will be important for civil society especially, and for all progressive politicians to ensure that there are no backtrack on specific legislation, and specifically on the EUDR. And I think is also what it's important to remind is that the climate, biodiversity, human rights are not following political priorities and do not follow the political agenda, but the science is clear. So this is the only reference point that should be followed. So that the hope is that the commitment will continue, and that also other jurisdictions such as the US and China will follow through suit.
Thank you so much, Giulia. And now to Emma, you get the last words in this section. Any recommendations? What do we need to see?
Thank you. Yeah, so please do refer to the briefing, which I believe the link for that is in the chat already, for the full breakdown of what we'd like to see from policymakers, companies and financial institutions. But in brief, for policymakers, we really do need to see international agreements, frameworks, and efforts include action on the human rights abuses that precede or accompany deforestation and conversion, and require companies and financial institutions to address these issues. And that includes free, prior, and informed consent, but also respecting customary rights to land, resources, and territory, and zero tolerance for violence and threats from forest, land, and human rights defenders. For companies, an effective commitment or policy demands that a company tests for and secures the free, prior, and informed consent of potentially affected Indigenous peoples and all local communities prior to acquiring new interests in land or resources. It's also critical that consultation with Indigenous peoples and local communities is an ongoing process, that it's not something that is done once, it is an ongoing conversation, and that if consent is not provided, then proposed developments or acquisitions should not go ahead. Companies should also commit to a zero tolerance approach for violence and threats against forest, land, and human rights defenders. And crucially, companies must show how they are implementing their commitments and report on their progress. So that could be through reporting the number of land developments or site acquisitions that used an FPIC approach, or the proportion of a total company land bank that overlaps with Indigenous local communities, territories. And then when we look to financial institutions, we do need to see financial institutions using that leverage to require the companies, the clients, the holdings that they finance to also follow that best practice. So testing and securing free, prior, and informed consent. And crucially for financial institutions, a good policy doesn't just encourage clients and holdings to act, it does require them to do so. It does need to be a central part of a company's relationship with a financial institution. So they must be comprehensive policies, they must apply to all clients or holdings that a financial institution have that are, regardless of size or whether they're a producer or a retailer, and it should be all types of asset classes as well. There is a lot of guidance and support that is available for those that need it. So for companies, there's resources like the AFI's, the Accountability Framework Initiative's operational guidance, which offers really detailed practical guidance for companies in forest risk supply chains. And financial institutions can refer to the Finance Sector Roadmap that Global Canopy published. Companies and financial institutions are not alone in this process. There needs to be change, and that action really can start today.
Thank you. It's been fascinating. It's now a chance for you to ask questions or make comments. I can see quite a few already in the Q&A box. I will start with the one for Giulia, I suppose. So does the panel think that broader ESG requirements coming into force globally will be the stick needed to force change, Giulia?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I might not have a full answer to it, but I think definitely ESG requirements are an important piece of the cake, and they can only have a leverage into the behavioral change of financial institutions and certain investments being done. However, I would not say that they are the only stick. I think there needs to be other measures and other requirements in place, and what we are calling for is really for proper due diligence obligations for the financial sector to ensure that the investments are not directly or indirectly linked with any deforestation and human rights abuses. But certainly they can be very helpful in pushing for this change to happen at the financial sector level, and hopefully this being taken by policymakers as well.
Okay, great. I'll ask this one to Adriana because it mentions Brazil, but Cathal can also make a comment. Feel free for that. So the question is, do you see FPIC as mandatory commitment that should be addressed by every company in the agricultural sector in Brazil, for example, or are these cases, situations, scenarios where FPIC is not relevant?
Well, in the case of Brazil, there are some legislations that previously set some limitations to the use of indigenous territories or traditional territories for other kind of activities. So I think that, as Cathal has said, is the minimum standard for anything that you would like to do. But in the case of Brazil, there are some situations in which it would not fit as a solution, you know, to build an approach. But as a minimum standard, it would be the way that any kind of discussion began. So the majority of communities in Brazil are already establishing their own protocols. And based on these protocols, any kind of dialogue about what's going to impact them should be based on FPIC.
Cathal, would you like to comment on that?
No, just to echo that, I mean, it's the peoples themselves that will tell you if FPIC is needed. I mean, that's what they're doing in these protocols. And it's very clear in human rights law that if there's a significant impact, potentially any significant impact, adverse impact, that FPIC is required. And if there wasn't any such impact, then the communities would give consent anyway. So it's sort of a mute question. Consent should be sought for any activity that potentially impacts on the rights of indigenous peoples.
Okay, great. Thank you. So to you, Emma, you mentioned that transparently publishing commitments and policies is key. How can we encourage more companies and financial institutions to do this?
Yeah, it absolutely is key. So the Forest 500 only uses publicly available information that companies or financial institutions have published themselves to push for that transparency that we do need to see. These issues are not something that one company somewhere at some point in a supply chain is facing. These are issues that are relevant to all companies across supply chains and across different supply chains. So the more transparency we see about commitments and processes that are in place, and crucially reporting on progress towards the effective implementation of those commitments, the more collaboration there can be across supply chains, within supply chains, and we can address these issues much quicker. But in terms of how we can encourage more companies and financial institutions to do this, it is complicated. There are some that have been being much more transparent, at least about the commitments that they have in place, but that's no longer sufficient. We do need to see transparency on the processes and crucially the progress that they're making. So initiatives like Forest 500, where we do only use publicly available commitments, do go some way towards that. But we do also need to see through regulation that, you know, that the companies and financial institutions need to be required to report transparently on this. We need to see that being mandated to enable that kind of collaboration. And financial institutions also have a role to play with the clients that they finance by requiring them to report this information. We need to see, you know, we can't just rely on voluntary action alone, nor can we just rely on voluntary reporting.
Thank you, Emma. Giulia, back to you. Would the country risk benchmarks of EUDR include human rights legality assessment? Giulia, can you hear us?
Yeah, here I am. Sorry, I had an issue with the mic. Yeah, so that's a very good question. So the country benchmarking assessment is still under development. So the European Commission is working on a methodology that will hopefully be as much as possible based on science and with no political interference into that. And in terms of the inclusion of human rights, this is a very important aspect. So the regulation is articulating several elements that would need to be included. And there is an aspect related to the legality requirements, but I think the way this will be waived into the methodology is still not clear. However, I think an important aspect into that is also related to reports and also, civil society investigations that are in the public domain that can be used to also leverage the discussion and be used as also evidence for the determination of different level of risks. But I think it's still to be seen.
Okay, thank you. Cathal, you wanted to make a comment on Emma's question on ESG, right?
Yes, yeah, just wanted to quickly add the question, I think that was related to Giulia's question as well, the previous question about ESG and the importance of developments in that area. I think it's critical that investors don't rely exclusively on reports from their clients in relation to how FPIC is respected, and there's a real need for independent verification of what's actually happening on the ground. So that's critical to the integrity of this being implemented, those ESG commitments actually being implemented. And coupled with that, there's a real need for support to Indigenous peoples and communities who are developing their own FPIC rules and laws and processes. So that has to go hand in hand with that for that to be effective. And then maybe the third thing is that, as we pointed out, there's a maybe not full understanding how FPIC is actually intimately and inseparable from the other land rights, self-determination rights, cultural rights. That needs to be understood if this is going to be meaningful as well.
Okay, thanks. Great. We're coming to an end, but there is still a chance to ask a question to Adriana, and that comes from the Q&A box. So sorry, I missed here. What should be the way when there is a conflict between Indigenous peoples and local communities and government companies try to halt deforestation in terms of how they use the land? For example, companies may want to drive EPCLCs out of the land to protect certain forests, and some communities want to continue using the forest the way they want, even though it may harm forests. Could this be solved easily through FPIC?
Well, in the case of Brazil, this sounds to me like fiction. I have never heard about a situation like that. The Brazilian constitution is very established in terms of what are the land rights for indigenous peoples and local communities. So of course, they are not also allowed to use the way they want the land, and there is a policy for management for indigenous territories in which each community has to develop their plan for the use of the territory, So I think that, as I said, FPIC is the basis for any kind of dialogue. And if there is a situation in which there is this risk of harming forests by a community, which I have never seen in Brazil, normally here, the indigenous territories and other traditional communities are have the lower rates of deforestation and degradation in Brazil. But if there is a situation like that, yes, FPIC would be the way to try to solve it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adriana. I think we come to an end. Thank you very much to all the panelists for their insights. Thank you all for joining us today and asking your questions. It's very clear that there is a huge progress to be made, and this important report provides enough data that could hold companies and financial institutions accountable. So now you can access our latest Forest 500 briefing on the Forest 500 website. The link is in the chat box. If you have any questions, you can get in touch with the team at forest500@globalcanopy.org. As I said before, this webinar has been recorded, so we will share the recording and links to the briefing soon. Last, we would be grateful if you could complete our short survey that should show in your web browser after this webinar. Goodbye for now.